evening, and thank you for taking the time to join us for our Latino Americans 500 Years of History program. This program is brought to you by a partnership between the North Las Vegas Library District and Vegas PBS through a grant sponsored by the National Endowment for the Humanities and administered by the American Library Association. My name is Forrest Lewis, and I will be acting as your moderator this evening. On stage, we have three very distinguished panelists who will be answering your questions and expounding on the Latino Americans episode that was just previewed. Acting as a resident scholar is Mr. Reuben da Silva. Mr. da Silva is a longtime resident of the Southern Nevada who is currently teaching history at his alma mater, Rancho High School, where he acts as advisor to the school's History Club and Hispanic Student Union. Mr. da Silva holds a bachelor's degree in American and European history from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and a master's degree in globalization studies from the University of Pennsylvania, and a second master's degree in comparative religion and politics from Yale University. He is an Iraq War veteran, committee member for the Las Vegas Cesar Chavez Day, former trustee for the North Las Vegas Library District, and he is currently running for Congress in Nevada District 1. Ms. Yvanna Cancela is the political director at the Culinary Workers Union Local 226. In her role, Ms. Cancela is responsible for the political education, lobbying, and mobilization of the 60,000-member union. She was recently awarded the White House's Champion of Change Award for the union's work on organizing for comprehensive immigration reform. Originally from Miami, Florida, Ms. Cancela is a graduate of Northwestern University. Jose Rivera is the former executive director of the Las Vegas Cesar Chavez Day. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas in Healthcare Administration and Policy Management, and he is associated with the National Society of Leadership and Success, Hispanics in Politics, and the Student Organization of Latinos. Your participation this evening is very much appreciated. If you would like to ask a question of the panelists or to bring up a topic for conversation, please raise your hand and someone will escort you to the podium.
My name is Micah Way. My question is directed to Reuben da Silva. As we know, he's running for the United States House of Representatives, and I want to know why he thinks it is important for minorities to vote.
Excellent question.
Thank you for your question, Micah. First and foremost, I think one of the biggest themes of this documentary series, episode 5 in particular of this awesome documentary series, is participation, civic participation, political participation, and the buzzword really is empowerment. And in a democracy, the way that we empower ourselves as people is through political participation. And again, we have two individuals here who also know this topic very well. So one of the things that Jose is actually involved with is a group called Voto Latino, which is an organization, a national organization that's specifically focused on empowering young millennials to get involved in the political process by getting out there and voting. Again, voting is one of our basic rights, and it's also the most direct way that you can bring change. This is what Cesar Chavez did in the fields of California, organizing, and then through that labor justice, creating political justice. The same thing with the movements in Colorado, the same thing with the movements in Texas, with the formation of La Raza Unida, a political party that really empowered the Chicano community in Texas, and again, created a revolution that wasn't when we think of the word revolution, we think of violence in the streets, chairs flying, cannonballs, but it was a political revolution that we do every 2 years here in this country, elections. So it's very, very important for minorities in particular to be involved in the voting process, the electoral process, because that's how we can assert ourselves and take our place at the table that is America.
Thank you.
Thank you for that question, Micah.
My question is directed at any of the three panelists. Do you think that the illegal immigration that we have rapidly here throughout the southwestern states deteriorates and distracts some of the amazing work that the Latinos have done in the community and building up the Mexican-American community?
Again, I think we're a nation of nations, a nation of immigrants. And And when we look at the broad patterns of migration throughout the 500 years of history that this documentary series it really encompasses, it's more of a building process. You know, when we look at the people who are coming into this country, you know, how they came into this country and the legalities that are used to define people. You know, I think the overarching story has been a positive one. You know, when Christopher Columbus came to the shores of Trinidad, you know, he wasn't, deemed an illegal person at that time. He was seen in many ways as an individual who was to be engaged with, and he was engaged with by those people. It's the same thing with the other communities that came to this country. Again, when we look at the American history at large, it really is a coming together of different types of peoples, the indigenous peoples and natives who lived here, the other communities from all across the world who came here, the African slaves who were brought here in chains. And it's we come together and forge our national identity in this sense. Now, this idea of people being called labeled illegal or undocumented is something that is very new to us as an American people. I think the first actual acts that were placed upon peoples were the Asian Exclusion Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, that said this group of people can't come here anymore. And then later on, you see a plethora of other acts, nationality acts, we call them, for a period of a few decades, going into the 1920s and into the 1940s. So when I look at the overarching, again, theme, you know, here, it's that when people come to this country, they add to it. They make this a better country and a stronger country. And again, we have an important decision by the Supreme Court that was handed out today. And again, first and foremost, you know, we need to make sure we have 9 judges there in that court so we can have an actual valid Supreme Court decision, you know, that should be made. But on the same token, I think overall, it's not about illegalities. It's about bringing people together, keeping families together, and moving forward as an American people.
And what is your name?
Tanner.
What's your question, Tanner?
I was just wondering if they treated Mexicans like that in certain states and country or all around the world.
Well, I'm not a history expert, and so it's hard to, that's really Reuben's area of expertise, so I think you should chime in here. But it was certainly what was happening in California was happening all over the United States and a number of border cities, including all over Texas, Arizona, here in Nevada. And it was a result of a growing population that had not really been dealt with in terms of a former structuralized, organized population. And as the population grew, so too did all sorts of fears about jobs and acculturation, and the xenophobia that came out of that time really spread all throughout border states, but even made its way up north. So maybe Reuben, you can fill in some historical context.
Yeah, the way that I've always looked at that too is, again, history matters here. Many of those states that we're looking at where these the xenophobia was taking place was part of Mexico, before 1848, before the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And again, there are some places where, states like New Mexico, where the local population there, didn't experience as much racism or as much xenophobia. And even to this day, there's a different sort of a legacy in places like New Mexico, but it's different in places like Arizona or California, where you start seeing larger groups of Anglo populations mixing with the locals who were already there before 1848. And again, as Yvanna mentioned over here, some of the racial tensions that took place. And that again, over the course of the 20th century, evolves into a situation where you do have segregated societies, certain neighborhoods where Mexicans are relegated to. And again, even in the East Coast, you see this happening in places like New York City, where you have certain neighborhoods that were Puerto Rican. Spanish Harlem is a good place, as a good example of this, or the Washington Heights, which was a Dominican neighborhood. And so we've seen that, this separations of peoples. But I think over the course of the last few decades in particular, we're seeing the actual coming together of these different groups. And that also in and of itself has caused some conflict. And we're seeing that today, as we interface with each other more. We don't have neighborhoods anymore. We just have cities now, and there's a lot more interconnection, social media interconnecting people. That again is causing a new type of maybe, I don't know if xenophobia is an appropriate word, but it's causing some sort of conflict, and we're seeing that in our daily lives today. So you're right about that. In America in particular has a very, a very interesting, at times, very conflict-ridden history with its Mexican population. And a big reason for that again was that half of the United States today was Mexico before 1848, and again that historical tension, that the creation of those social fabrics, and then the breaking apart of those social fabrics back and forth has caused a lot of that tension that you were pointing to. Very good question. That's very impressive.
Thank you.
One of the best quotes that I saw in the documentary was, or I heard in the documentary rather, was an observation by someone who said, this wasn't just their civil rights, it was civil rights for all of us. That's one of the things that really stood out to me. And I think my biggest worry right now is in the political environment, it's kind of a, if you will, political xenophobia. It's a separation. Everybody's trying to basically single out every group and all these individuals, when in fact we should be coming together. I mean, of course there's these great groups like La Raza and the NAACP nationwide, and the smaller groups on the local scale as well. But I was wondering, how do you think, or what do you think is the best strategy to actually combat that political xenophobia?
I got that one. So Voto Latino actually just launched a campaign. It's called Brave, and it actually emphasizes the intersectionality of all movements, pretty much recognizing that our neighbor's struggle is also our struggle. All of these people during the 1960s, they weren't really part of all these separate movements. They were actually all connected, as was seen when the protesters came out in East Los Angeles to protest against anti-war, because so many Latinos were being killed during the Vietnam War, and it was, I believe, 20% of them that made up the casualties. And at that time, Latinos only made 6% of the US population. So, it's kind of recognizing that we're not just all these individual movements, we're all part of this one big movement. All of these people were, they were brave people that came together, and they all fought collectively against injustice. And ideally, what they were fighting for is to create, a country that was more, much more representative of the values that they would like.
So do you see your movement as an extension of that?
Yes.
Good stuff.
I also want to add here that I think in looking at not just the civil rights movement, but the Chicano rights movement, women's rights movement, at the core of all of these different struggles are economic issues. People are fighting to have a dignified life. People are fighting to be able to access a middle class. And so when you look at things like the civil rights movement, Dr. King was, before he shot, headed to fight on a union picket strike line, right? The Chicano workers weren't just fighting for Chicano rights, they were fighting for union rights. And so everything is interconnected in a struggle for a basic standard of living in this country. And I think what's happened is that more and more groups are being affected by the wage gap or the wealth gap that's happening in this country, where there are more and more people feeling left behind while very few become extremely wealthy. And in all of our struggles, that's what connects us. It's not about who has more power, which group has access to what congressional seat or what city council seat. It's about what we are doing as a people to really maintain a middle class that is accessible and open to as many people as possible.
So in your view, it's more classism than racism at this point?
I think that the two are so intertwined that it's hard to ignore that minorities are largely being left behind as other groups are continuing to amass wealth. And so it's difficult to ignore that similar groups are being affected in similar ways by a system that clearly is not designed for people to get ahead.
Agreed. Mr. De Silva?
Yeah, and I'll just say something real quick too, and both of our the esteemed panelists here pointed to that. It's more than just civil rights. Civil rights implies some sort of legal right that you're denied. It's more basic than that. I would even argue and say more basic than even economic, issues. It's about human dignity. It's human rights that are at play over here. When I know Cesar Chavez, before he was anything else, he was a union organizer. He was fighting for labor justice. And he mentioned that it was something basic, like one of his female friends not having to use the bathroom in public. These are the small things that actually that really chipped away at him, and this was rampant throughout the Delano Valley there. Again, something that was more compounded on dignity. The same thing in those neighborhoods in East San Antonio or the west side of San Antonio. No plumbing, no water. These are basic human needs that were being pushed to the side here because you didn't have an access to a justice system or a political system where you weren't empowered. So it's much more basic than civil rights. Many of the movements that we look at and we study, the 1960s as a whole can be seen as a human rights movement. Whether it's the African American civil rights movement, whether it's the Chicano movement in the western part of the country, whether it's the LGBT rights movement that began in the 60s, the women's rights movement. That period, the Warren Court has historically been called the era of the rights revolution. Criminal justice reform, Gideon versus Wainwright, so many of these important, Miranda versus Arizona, important laws or Supreme Court decisions that were passed then. So again, human rights, that's what should be really looked at over here. And that's something that's universal to everybody, no matter where you are, no matter who you are, no matter how much you make, no matter what country you live in, no matter who you are, you're a human being, and human dignity is at the core of this.
Thank you all for your answers.